Richard, my one big thing this week, Saudi Arabia's economy, and a little update on where the kingdom is now. This podcast, Richard, is now old enough, it's 97 episodes in, to have covered and discussed the kingdom's economy when it was in a different place than it is right now. And I think, Richard, when you're discussing a country, and the focus for this podcast, the 966, obviously Saudi Arabia, there's a lot to talk about. You can talk about the economy, society, culture, and sports. We do cover it all. But I think if you know one thing about Saudi Arabia from listening to this podcast, or just pretty much in general, or that if you should know one thing about Saudi Arabia, it is that it is in the middle of a total economic transformation of the economy away from oil. And that's really what is behind pretty much everything: sports, cultural changes. It's Vision 2030, and they're trying to change the entire economy from being completely, pretty much completely dependent on oil to not. And that's really it. It's as simple as that. And so we're right in the middle of that. And so I was going to do an update, Richard, on Saudi Arabia's economy. Before we do that, I was sort of curious. We're talking about Vision 2030, launched in 2016, April 25th, 2016. So we're 7 years and 3 months into it, and it's a 14-year plan. It's not going to be completely done by 2030. Many things will be completed or realized after 2030, but 2030 is the way in, Richard, when they're like, all right, how do we do? Let's take a look at this. That's a 14-year plan. We're 7 years and 3 months into it. We're just past halftime. We're in the second half of it. And so I was thinking, how is it doing? How do you even evaluate it? We can't, because we're going to wait till 2030. But you can see if things are happening and if things are trending in the right direction. So that's just, I feel like that's sort of like, and Richard, this is the fork in the road where I started going down on that. And I say, wait, I was going to talk about the economy like in July 2023. So I'll veer back in that direction, but as a good sort of, give us some guardrails on this, because we have to keep in mind that what's going on in Saudi Arabia's economy today and what was happening last year and what will happen next year is all part of a larger plan, which doesn't exist everywhere in other countries, but it does in Saudi Arabia. And Richard, so 2022, really strong year for Saudi Arabia's economy. Oil prices soared, resulting from the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Saudi Arabia was the fastest growing G20 economy in 2022. Overall growth reached 8.7%, reflecting both strong oil production, but also a 4.8% non-oil GDP growth, driven by robust private consumption and non-oil private investment. It was a good year for the kingdom in many ways, but it wasn't all rosy. The PIF, as we discussed last week, reported an $11 billion loss for 2022 compared to a $19 billion gain in 2021. Though with global equities on the rebound, Richard, this year in 2023, it looks like they'll get some of that back. But anyway, 23 is not looking like the rosy year for the kingdom. And in fact, looks like a tougher year for the kingdom's economy. This is because of oil again. This month, the kingdom got the largest growth downgrade among major economies from the IMF. But Richard, there's a lot to like in all the recent data that came out. We have all the data from the first half of the year, and we actually also have some data from now July 2023. But I'm going to discuss kind of the bad news first, because I think it makes sense in the story of Vision 2030, and then the good news. So bad news first. Latest data show that Saudi Arabia has now entered a technical recession. This is according to a recent report from Capital Economics, which was based on data from GA Stat, which is a very good statistical organization for Saudi Arabia. Really just the government data that comes out of that people then use to enter into models and make forecasts and analyze the Saudi economy. Data show that real GDP in Saudi Arabia increased by 1.1% during the second quarter of 2023 compared to the same period of last year. However, oil activities decreased by 4.2% compared to the same period of that year. The results also demonstrated that the seasonally adjusted real GDP declined by 0.01% during the second quarter of 2023 compared to the first quarter. So that's the recession they're sort of talking about. With oil cuts likely to continue, and Richard, we actually know today, just came out, they will continue through September. They just agreed to that. The Saudi economy is likely to experience a contraction for the entire year, the report said, and could result in the worst GDP performance in over 2 decades for the kingdom, excluding, of course, the impact of the global financial crisis and the pandemic. So more data out, Richard, showed the kingdom's budget deficit widening in the second quarter as the government raised spending on social benefits and projects meant to diversify the economy. Government income rose, driven mainly by higher non-oil revenue. I'll get to that in a second. That's a good part. I kind of slipped it in there, which Crown Prince MBS is still trying to grow as he looks to end the boom bust oil cycle's impact on the economy. Still, the government's deficit came in at 5.3 billion reals, which is $1.4 billion, around 80% higher than that for the first quarter. Just last bit on the more concerning side for the kingdom's economy, before we get to some of the good news, a key gauge of borrowing costs in Saudi Arabia has risen to a record. The cost of money, as measured by the 3-month Saudi interbank offered rate, SIBOR, climbed above 6% this week, even higher than it was during the 2008 global financial crisis and after oil prices collapsed in 2020. The rate was below 1% only 18 months ago. Its rise has come as the U.S. Federal Reserve has hiked interest rates to lower inflation, with its latest move of 25 basis points coming last week. So there's some concerning stuff there, Richard. Essentially, with these moves that Saudi Arabia has made on the oil front to prop up prices, it's kind of expensive. But the good news, Richard, and this is actually fairly significant if you put it in the context of Vision 2030. In the same period we've been discussing, the second quarter of 2023, the non-oil economy grew by 5.5% compared to the same period of last year in 2022. Now, since that report was released earlier this week, Richard, and again, as I mentioned, this was sort of like an avalanche of reports. We're trying to put it all together. We've also seen figures from July. Non-oil business activity in Saudi Arabia did ease a little bit in July after output surged to multi-year highs the previous month. The seasonally adjusted Riyadh Bank Saudi Arabia Purchasing Managers Index eased to 57.7% in July. It's down from 59.6% in June. That's the lowest since December 2022, although it remained above the long run average. Of course, anything above 50 is expansion. So that's still good news, even if there's a bit of an easing. Back to the Bloomberg item on the government budget, the good news in there, 12% increase in revenues outpaced by a 13% rise in expenditure. So they're spending more than they're taking in, but that is largely due to a doubling of social benefits and a jump in capital expenditure. Non-oil revenue jumped 32% to 135 billion reals, according to a budget report from the Ministry of Finance published on Thursday. Oil income increased 0.6% to 180 billion reals during the quarter, but fell 28% year on year. So look, here we are, Richard, halfway through Vision 2030, just got out of the locker room. We're heading back in for the second half, and you're looking at the economy as still pretty dependent on oil. I think that's fair, but you also see so much progress in changing that. You see these non-oil GDP figures staying solid. And, of course, you could get into it. That's only part of the story. But we should keep in mind the goal is reduction of dependence on oil, not the elimination of it. Strengthening the non-oil sector has been crucial for Saudi Arabia. And that's really just Vision 2030 in a nutshell. You have these other things that they have. They are looking to improve the quality of life, provide more opportunity for women. There's a bunch of things that they're trying to do, but really the diversification of the economy is key. And then, Richard, just on this, the PMI report further pointed out that I just referenced that survey respondents were upbeat on long-term business expansion plans and subsequent efforts to boost operating capacity in July. This optimism, this is according to Arab News, which ran the survey. This optimism resulted in a rise in employment numbers for the 16th month in a row, although the pace of hiring was the weakest since November 2022. So what we see here, Richard, just stepping back, we see the progress on the non-oil economy, nurturing it to a point where it continues to contribute more and more. And we're seeing it being quite resilient. We're seeing that after the global pandemic. We're seeing it, now despite oil prices going down a little bit. So they have a strategy in Saudi Arabia. They're implementing it. The game is not over. We're going to see these ups and downs in the economy. But what we're seeing is, I think, in my opinion, definitive progress in the development of the non-oil economy. I mean, and we're not even really there yet in terms of having the tourism sector fully operational and having all of these goals realized. We have 7 more years to get there until we really take a look at it and say, hey, how did it go? But yeah, see, Richard, and that's my one big thing, but see, Richard, we get into this thing and we kind of understand it. And then we go down other rabbit holes and we're like, we got to try to right the ship here a little bit. But it's just interesting what you see in the Saudi economy today. You see oil still very important, critically important, but you also see progress in making it less important for the Saudi economy. And you can see that in the non-oil GDP figures.
That's a good one, and it's an important one too. And I think you put your finger on some key things because on this show, I think I've used the term. I've seen, Saudi Arabia's having a moment. 2022 was a moment. I mean, the oil revenue was insane. The 8.7 GDP growth. Obviously G20 leading. I mean, it's sort of win to win to win, and we know that that's not going to happen. Not going to sustain. You're going to have downturns. And we see Saudi Arabia significantly curtailing its production and trying to prop up oil prices. I think in anticipation of China and the global economy coming back strong towards the end of the year. I think that's their read. So they're taking it on the chin now, and it does translate into the budget, into that sort of thing, because as you say, oil is still preponderant. How the dynamism of the non-oil sector is really encouraging, and you're exactly right. When one of the main pillars of Vision 2030 is thriving economy, and a big aspect of that is the non-oil economy and diversification. So it's good to see that continue, even though oil revenues are down. I also think you talked about a strategy, and one of the things Saudi Arabia has done better under Vision 2030 is become more transparent in terms of its budget and its intended spending. And I think that really, in terms of messaging and sentiment, is critical in times like this, where, okay, we got, general revenue is down, we're running a deficit, but the government has made it clear we're still heavily investing in capital expenditure and infrastructure and these giga projects. I mean, they're still investing strongly. They're maintaining it. I hope, and I'm sure that, I don't know what the commitment is, but let's say, oil continues to sputter. It's not sputtering. It's about mid 80s right now, but, falls down or whatever. It doesn't recover as projected. Will Saudi Arabia continue to deficit spend in order to support the private sector? Because really, the private sector still relies on it considerably. I mean, Saudi Arabia is trying to improve the private sector through a number of things: regulatory reform, private investment, PIF, and government spending is a tremendously important engine in the private sector. Buying into key sectors and promoting sectors they think we're going to, should be, looking to privatize, looking to invest and then privatize. So, I mean, the government, needs to keep spending for the non-oil economy to keep growing. And it's committed to doing that. And we'll see, again, if this goes on in terms of overall revenues to the state, if they continue to do that or if they pull back, and what the sentiment on all this will be. But this is exactly what we've talked about when we say Saudi Arabia is having a moment. The test is not when you're in the moment. The test is when the moment's gone. And I personally think they're going to stay the course, keep investing. You mentioned an important thing, and that's the cost of money. And even when Saudi Arabia didn't have huge revenues, they could get bonds and loans for cheap because the cost of money was not high. When you're paying debt or you're looking out for new funds and the cost of money is what it is now, that's a disincentive. So it'll be interesting to see what their options and the options they take. Maybe they won't go to the markets for money, but they'll just keep spending down and run a budget deficit. But again, these decisions are critical, and as you point out, we're halfway between here and 2016 and 2030, and a lot of what happens right now, a lot of what happens in the next 6 to 12 months, will determine where they are in 2030. If they can get through this, keep the momentum, keep the non-oil and diversification sectors of their economy growing and optimistic, willing to invest, confidence level high, then that's a big win. And you made me laugh when you said bad news, good news. My middle son, Sam, always, when he comes to me, says, "Dad, got good news and bad news. Which do you want to hear first? And he knows I always want to hear the bad news first because you want to finish on the good news.
Of course, yeah.
But yes, I like your sequencing. We do the same thing at the Wilson household too.
Well, it's interesting because we just discussed this, Richard. It's a mixed picture, but the good news is really the more important news in the long run. And the other thing that's interesting, Richard, about this is all because of a Saudi strategy on propping up oil prices, as we both mentioned and discussed. It looks like some are predicting for their strategy to work. For example, Goldman Sachs saying that demand will reach an all-time high. Some shale, I saw some shale CEOs in the US predicting that it'll be sustained at about $100 a barrel, at least on the West Texas Intermediate next year. So look, I mean, and I actually don't know how this works. Like if Saudi Arabia were to say, actually, you know what, we changed our mind, we're going to pump 12 million barrels a day and flood the market, would they make less money overall if the price goes down? Like it all depends on how many you're selling and what the price is per barrel, right? And there's buyers. So there's a strategy here that they're pursuing, but maybe it works and maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, yes. But that's also the problem. And I'm not an expert, but I mean, there's all that Russian discounted oil out there. You're not going to undercut that. That's already selling at a deep discount.
Right.
I mean, it's Russia's situation is becoming a problem for Saudi Arabia, not only because they're not really hitting their production quotas in terms of cutting back, but also, I mean, when China and India can get cheap Russian fuel, how do you compete with that?
Right. Right. And Saudi Arabia is importing a lot of Russian fuel itself as well to meet its own domestic needs. So anyway, interesting kind of look at the Saudi economy, Richard. Last year, it was just full steam ahead. And that was a moment. They're still kind of having a moment in a lot of respects, but it's when times are really good and times are really bad that you sort of learn about where you are and who you are. And I think Saudi Arabia has not adjusted, other than, modifying for the better some of the targets and KPIs of Vision 2030 to be more realistic and more impactful. But the overall vision is exactly as it was in 2016, and it should stay that way until 2030. And then you reevaluate. But anyway, Richard, this is just, it's super interesting. So,
we look at the leaders. These are moments, there are moments, periods, eras, whatever, that bind people to its government. And by that, I mean, either, they become less confident or more confident. The regimes, the Saudi government's performance during COVID clearly won the confidence and support of the Saudi population. It was responsible, decisive, and as it turned out to be, very effective. That's a big confidence builder.
Mm-hmm.
What the government does here in these economic headwinds, again, is another opportunity to show leadership and to sort of just, reinforce and affirm the population's confidence in the direction of the country. If you turn tail at the first difficulty and say, oh, we're contracting spending and we're gonna slow down the timetables on all these projects, that would just crush sentiment.
Yeah.
If you can get through this with everybody believing we're headed and pulling in the same direction, the government's been transparent, they've been consistent in their messaging. Again, socially, politically, it really enhances the government's stature, if you ask me.